In the previous videos, we looked at a couple of specific controls that you can use from UI Toolkit, and basically what are their specifics and what are they exposing for you. Now, obviously we are going to touch a lot more controls in the upcoming lessons, but not that deep, sort of. We are not going to look at their specifics. We are just going to use them and say some words kind of by the way. Now, the idea of this video is to basically give you a tool or a technique how to help yourselves and how to basically orient yourselves when you start using a new control, or you know you need a new control, and how to find out what to do actually. Now, obviously, I'm sure a lot of you already have some techniques or know how to do this in other systems and other technologies. Obviously, one way is to just do trial and error, but a good idea before you actually do trial and error is to have just a brief look at how those things are documented and what you can actually find in the official documentation. And that oftentimes saves you a lot of work because you already basically know what things you need to touch. And so that's what we are going to do now. We are just going to take a brief look at the Unity documentation and how to find specific components and specific classes in it. Now, the first thing that you can see here is just the Unity manual. And it has quite a lot of information on UI Toolkit. They are not always super easy to read because they use kind of other things that you might not know, and so depending on how deep you're already in it, it's rather easy or not so super easy to read that. However, you can find a lot of information and also a lot of stuff that we already covered in here. So if you're interested in that, just go to this URL. And now, one first thing that is important here is that you should choose roughly the version that you are currently using. So we are using, throughout this course, we are using Unity versions of 2022.1. And depending on what year you are watching this course, if you are, I don't know, 5 years in the future and that course is still relevant, you might have a 2026 or whatever 2027 Unity version. And then obviously some of those things might be different. And then you might be wondering, why is there something in here that is actually not happening in my Unity editor? So the reason that might happen is that you chose the wrong version. So for us, we will go on 2022.1. And now we are, however, now not really interested in the manual. What we are interested in is the scripting API. So when we go over there, you can see we get a slightly different screen. The version thing applies exactly the same. And now here on the left-hand side, you can basically browse all the Unity classes there are, also in all the other parts of Unity that you have, not only UI Toolkit. However, we know that we can find the UI Toolkit library under Unity Engine and UI Elements, I think. And for that, we have it just here. Here you can see Unity Engine UI Elements. Now when we expand this and go under classes, you can see we can find all sorts of classes, also a couple of ones that we already used. Like you can see a button here, you can see a label that we already used, or for example the slider. So those were the 3 controls that we actually used, and we could inspect them here. Let's now just go let's go to the button, for example. And you can see we get a page with a description and a documentation on the button. And now, before we actually cover the contents of those pages here, the first thing that I would like you to look at is this section above here, and particularly those things where it says inherits from. Now, you know that C#, that Unity is using C#, and C# is an object-oriented language. So obviously the classes that we are using in UI Toolkit are also object-oriented, and they use something called inheritance. And now what that means is that a button is not only a button in a sense, but it's also the thing that it inherits from. So a button is also, as you can see here, a text element. And so now let's just open this text element. And now a text element is also a bindable element, for example. And a bindable element, finally, is also a visual element. And now by the transitive rule, that also means that a button is also a visual element, as we already said. Now, a visual element itself is also inheriting from other things, but let's not go that deep for this. It's still a sort of introductory course. So let's just focus on the thing that, let's always reach this visual element level and kind of stop the discussion there. Once you are deeper into UI Toolkit, you can also check what is actually happening above the visual element. But for now, the important thing is to understand now, when we would search for some properties and some behaviors of the button, and we would, I don't know, use something in the code editor or experiment around with something, and we are kind of looking for where to find this in the documentation. If you don't find this on the button class, it might be the case that it's actually on one of its parent classes that it inherits from, or just from the visual element itself. Because you can see, and now let's go a little bit deeper into this content here. Most of the properties of most elements are actually coming from the visual element. So you can see we have all sorts of properties that are coming from the visual element. And that obviously means that every element that inherits from the visual element will also have those properties. So I don't know, we used a couple of those, like we used the style property, for example. I think we used the name property somewhere. Stuff like that. All sorts of things that you can find here, you can obviously also use on a button, on a label, or any other control that you're going to use. So now let's see how are those pages actually built up. Now we have a description section over here for the visual element. Those are just a couple of lines, and you can see here a visual element is a base class for objects that are part of the UI elements visual tree. And blah, 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 something more. Then you have those properties that are actually part of the visual element, of this element that you are kind of looking at the moment. Those are those static properties, those properties here, just a constructor, and your public methods. And then you have a section which starts here and kind of goes further down. Those are properties and methods that are not actually coming from the visual element, but that are coming from the elements that the visual element inherits from. So sort of its parent and grandparent, and however many things it might inherit from. So when we want to understand how to read this thing, actually, let's just move this thing to the side, and let's open the visual element on the right hand side and the bindable element on the left hand side, and you can see the bindable element is sort of one level beneath the visual element, so it's inheriting directly from the visual element. And now you can see that those properties that are kind of specific to the visual element here, that were added to the visual element under the properties section, those you can find under the inherited stuff of the bindable element. So you can see, for example, when you look for the child count property, you can find this under the inherited properties here, child count, right? Or we would like to have the name that is also coming from the visual element. Obviously, that's also under the inherited things. And now the things that are sort of special to this bindable element that are not in the visual element, those things are only, in this case, only those two properties. So you can see this thing looks pretty complicated. It has a lot of stuff on it in this documentation page, but if you know how to interpret that, you understand that the bindable element is a very simple thing that basically only adds those two properties. Now, what those properties actually are, we are not interested in this right now, but we are only interested to kind of interpret this documentation. So you can see the bindable element is something pretty simple here, at least in terms of numbers of new properties. It only adds those two. And when we go up the chain, you can see a text element has a couple of more things, which are going up to here basically. Those are the new things that a text element gives you. For example, the text property, as you might expect. And then finally, the button itself, its new properties or its specific properties and methods are just those ones. You can see we don't have any methods actually, but what we have, for example, is this clicked event here that we already used. And you can see that this is actually specific for the button. So for example, the text element above didn't have this, this event, and the visual element itself also didn't have this element. So those are the things that are added to the button. Again, a button is also a visual element. It's also a text element. And it also has some additional specific button specific stuff. And those are just those things that we highlighted here. So I hope that this makes some kind of sense, and you have if you didn't have it already, you now have a basic understanding how to basically help yourselves with new controls that you want to figure out how they work. Just find a control here and then go down this chain of inheritance sort of until you get the visual element. And then you should see all the things that might be, all the properties and the methods, just the things that are exposed that might be interesting for you to use. Now, let's just see one more complicated example for a second here. Let's now say we would take something like a list view. Let's close the other tabs, and you can already see for a list view, you have much more text here, which is actually very good because this already is telling you sort of how to use it. You even have an example, which is great. But then you also get into this section here where you again have its specific properties. Those are not actually too many for the list view itself. But obviously the list view is also inheriting from something that is called base list view. And then there are many more properties that, depending on your use case, might be interesting to look into for you. And if you would go this chain further, you would finally again reach the visual element. So summary: use the documentation, play around with it. Be careful to use the correct version that you're actually using in your Unity editor. Remember that you have this this possibility to find out what those elements are actually inheriting from and go down this chain of inheritance. And that way you should be able to, in 99 of 100 cases, to find the information that you actually need. Sometimes there are certain specific things that are not really mentioned in the documentation, and those you would then only find, for example, in your code editor in IntelliSense. I had a couple of examples where some properties were actually not exposed here in the documentation, which probably means that for normal use cases you shouldn't need them, but it might also happen that they sometimes just forgot something. So be careful there. You can also find these sorts of things, obviously, then finally in your code editor when you're working on the real classes. But as I said, I guess in 99 of 100 cases, at least for your medium advanced stuff and not your absolutely pro stuff, when you basically try to, rewrite the editor or stuff like that, you should be fine with the documentation and you should be able to find a lot of information here. So that's enough for this. See you in the next lesson.